Next month's program on February 5th is going to be Barry Robinson here in Steventown, talking about the Freedom Rides. So look forward to that. And today, for the third time, Eric Durr is here to talk about D-Day behind the scenes. Eric is
that's okay.
Something with the New York National Guard.
Yeah, I can fill it in.
Okay. He's got a lot of qualifications for this, and interested in military history, and is here after patiently waiting, and we're patiently waiting till we can all be together and have this talk about D-Day behind the scenes.
So I'm supposed to use this one, right?
Yep, got to turn it on.
Where's the on? Oh, it's on. It's on, testing, okay. So, as Meredith said, I was the first of the New Year's speakers, and then COVID hit, and that was fine because I was working like 24 hours a day for a while anyway. It's kind of interesting to hear the meeting stuff. Last time I did this, I got to sit through the meeting of the West Sand Lake Association for the Prevention of Horse Theft. And it must be working because I think horse theft is down in West Sand Lake. So I thought that was really cool. So I am a retired Army officer, Army National Guard officer, former newspaper reporter, and I now work as the spokesman for the New York National Guard. And the reason I'm talking about this is because, like any Army officer, you usually have an interest in military history. I'm a graduate of the Command and General Staff College, which sounds a lot more impressive than it actually is. But I served as an armor officer, battalion commander, battalion XO, company commander, and a division plans officer for a few years. So I don't know how many people here have served, but I will try not to get too technical. But what I'm going to talk about is the things I find interesting in military history, and which is not necessarily what's in the movies. So that's why I call this sort of D-Day behind the scenes, because it's the stuff you don't normally talk about, but I think is fascinating. So this is the famous map of the invasion of Normandy. Everybody has probably seen that at some point in time in the newspaper, or if you're a military history buff, you've seen that map a zillion times. You know, Utah, Omaha, the British beaches, the Canadian beach, who went where, what famous things Norm Cota did, how Teddy Roosevelt Jr. said the war starts here, how they almost got wiped out at Omaha Beach, but they didn't. We're not going to talk about any of that. How many people have seen the movie The Longest Day? Yeah, that sort of started D-Day. If you look at the historiography of D-Day, that started D-Day as a thing people were really interested in. It's a great book. It was an awesome movie. It's got a song. What more can you say? And but we're not going to talk about that because I think it's more interesting of the things that allowed this to happen. You know, there's a saying in the military that amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. You know, the difference is that one is, you know, we're going to put, you know, a tank company over here, we're going to go this way. But the other one is all the stuff it takes to get those 65 people and those 14 tanks and those 250 rounds of ammunition where they have to be. And I think that's really kind of, to me, interesting and sort of provides the context for this. So the things I want to kind of focus on is logistics. And that's the definition of logistics. It's moving people and stuff. The famous Confederate general, whose name escapes me suddenly, I can't believe this, is famous for saying that it's all about getting there firstest with the mostest. And that's the same thing with this. And then what we talk about in the art of planning an operation is shaping operations. So you don't just go and charge, you know, as we used to joke, hey diddle diddle, straight up the middle. You do things to make the battle turn out your way. Another famous military saying, those of you who might have served might have heard this, if you find yourself in a fair fight, you messed up. You know, you don't want a fair fight. You want everything going your way. And the last thing is doctrine. And doctrine is the way a military organization acts and thinks. You know, every military has its doctrine. The U.S. Army has a doctrine. They rewrite it every 10 years. You know, I got out in 2008. You know, what we used to call command and control is now mission command. Everything changes. Although, just a side note, General Rommel, who the U.S. Army faced in Normandy, once famously said, "It's not worth studying American doctrine. The Americans don't follow it, so it doesn't do any good to figure out what they're doing." Not sure if he actually said that, but that is an aphorism that gets quoted a lot. So we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics behind this, the shaping operations, what made the invasion of Normandy successful, and the doctrine of the militaries involved. And I'm unashamedly American-centric. You know, there was a famous book by an author called John Keegan, 5 Armies in Normandy, but 2 counted, the British and the American. You know, he counts the Canadians and the French and the Poles. So to kick off, now Normandy is more than just an invasion, and I realize you can't really see that map too well, but it's really a campaign. So the way it works in the military, you know, you have battles, you have engagements, which are part of battles, which are part of a campaign, which is part of your operational plan, and over the top of everything is strategy. So the invasion on D-Day was part of a campaign that eventually involved defeating the German army in detail, chasing them back out of France by the end of August. And that's because of superior logistics, a better doctrine, and I also think better integration of air power, armor, and artillery. And just talk a little bit about this. So the invasion of Normandy was just the start. June 6th is the start. The Normandy campaign lasts until the end of August. And a campaign is a series of battles that wear down the enemy. So the difference is, so the Allies, the Germans, the British and the Americans, I can't believe I said that, made a conscious decision that they were not going to fight an infantry-intensive war. The British were still traumatized by World War I. I don't know if you know your World War I history, but you know, 25,000 dead and 40,000 wounded the first day of the Somme. And our army had had enough of that in the Battle of the Argonne, where more than 1 million men fought. Still the largest American battle of all time was in World War I. So they made a conscious decision that we're not going to fight an infantry war. So they invested money in firepower, artillery, air power, and the Navy. Easy for England. England had always been a naval power. The United States was a naval power. Now, the U.S. Army had traditionally fought this way since 1864. You know, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman basically won the Civil War by just saying, okay, we're just going to keep attacking and attacking and attacking, and the South lost. The British wanted to avoid a repeat of World War I, which had traumatized them. And so the idea was to use tanks, artillery, air power, and as a shaping operation, strategic air power. That's the big 4-engine airplanes you've probably seen on the old TV show, 12 O'Clock High, the B-17s, the B-24s. And the Germans called this material Schlacht, which is a good German word. It basically because they couldn't do it. You know, the Germans always argued that the Allies won the war because they just kept throwing stuff at them. And my reaction, and I think many people said, yeah, so who cares? You know, you lost. It doesn't matter how you lose as long as you lose. And it kept British and American casualties low. The Germans lost a phenomenal number of people. My wife and I were assigned to the army in Germany in the early 80s. And there were an awful lot of, you know, German women who are now my age. They were my age then. I was 23. They seemed really old. They'd never been married. They never got a chance to be married because an entire generation of young German men had died in 1944 and 43 and 45. And that did not happen in the United States because we made a concerted decision that we're not doing that. Germany's a land power. We weren't a land power. We were a sea power. And we became an air power. And we purposely limited the number of divisions. Same for the British. So what the Germans did was, because they knew they could not win a war of attrition, which is what they wound up fighting and losing, is they built everything around the idea of they have to win the war right now, because they can't last. So in the early days of World War II, if you're familiar with your history, the Germans, wiped out Poland in 8 weeks. They then managed to defeat France in 6 weeks. Books have been written called Strange Victory and things like that, because the Germans couldn't fight very long. But it didn't work in North Africa, because the British and the Americans were a different enemy. It had air power. And quite frankly, because the US was supplying the British Army. If you think about what's going on in Ukraine today, it was the same thing for the British in 1940 and 41. The British Army in North Africa waited till we sent them 300 tanks, and then they launched an attack. So we were, the arsenal democracy. So same thing. In the face of this, the Nazis had always played up, the individual will. If you remember, the famous propaganda movie about the Nuremberg Conference was Triumph of the Will, and that's the way they thought. We fight better than you. We'll win because we're better fighters. And they also played up aces. The Germans liked, submarine aces, fighter aces, tank aces. I mean, if you're the tank commander, you're not the guy that pulls the trigger when you blow up another tank. It's your gunner. And the Germans generally didn't pay as much attention to logistics as the U.S. Army did. I mean, basically, the U.S. Army really does logistics well. That's one thing we're very good at, because if we go to war with a coalition, other countries helping us, behind the scenes, we're the one bringing forward all the supplies, because we've got all the stuff. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Army the United States built. So the U.S. Army at the beginning of World War II was small. It was like the 16th largest army in the world. We had troops in the Philippines, which, as you recall, was an American colony. We had troops in Hawaii. We had troops in the Panama Canal. And we had a bunch of regiments scattered all over the United States. So we had to make an army. And starting in 1940, they mobilized the entire National Guard, which I think is about 150,000 guys. And then they started drafting people. And so they put together a system to make divisions. So you start with individual training, and then you start with unit training. And we also standardize these divisions. In the U.S. Army, every infantry division was the same. Every tank division was the same. We had a very few airborne divisions, and we also had a couple specialty divisions. There was a mountain division, things like that. But our divisions were identical. They were cookie cutter. So, you built this division, and then you would go in, take the best guys out of that division, and send them to build another division. So eventually they had this number of divisions, 89 divisions. The Germans had about 223. The Russians had about the same. So we had this way to take a guy who had been a soda jerk, draft him, and turn him into a soldier in about a year. And it worked. The other thing we did was make officers. So you have to have officers. Now, during the interwar, what's called the interwar period, we had ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, and a lot of young men got through college, trained to be an officer, going back to the Morrill Land Act, and they made a little extra money. And then during the Depression, when President Roosevelt started the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Army ran those. So, over here in Cherry Plains State Park, there was a CCT, Civilian Conservation Corps camp there. It was run by a reserve officer who'd been an ROTC student in college. So you had an awful lot of guys who learned how to do the basics of managing people during the Depression. So you had them. But you still need more officers. So you found a really smart soldier who maybe gone to college or did well on his test. You sent him to school for 90 days, and he was an officer. Now, the Germans had a much more deliberate system where you had to be a sergeant, and you served as a sergeant cadet, and then they made you an officer, and they were awesome people, but you didn't get nearly as many officers. Somebody, again, one of those joke things, once wrote, the U.S. Army won World War II because every time a second lieutenant got killed, there was another one. And so, this really worked. The Germans, on the other hand, they had 315 infantry divisions, 21 panzer divisions, and 10 parachute divisions, which they never used again after 1941. But the point is, none of these divisions were the same. You know, part of this is the German propaganda was so effective that if you talk to people today about the German Army World War II, they have this image of guys hopping out of, you know, the half track and tanks charging across the plains. That was like 20 divisions. Most of these infantry divisions marched. Most of the logistics was horses. They had a ton of horses, which means you also have to have a bunch of hay. Hay is much harder to transport than oil is, or gasoline. And the other thing is you can't really let a horse forage because usually they don't eat enough. So it's a complication. And in Normandy, they were manned by what was called static divisions, which meant they weren't going anywhere. They were going to do what, again, those of you who are in the military, we used to joke about as the dip, the die in place. So you're going to fight and you're not going anywhere because they had no maneuverability. An American infantry division had enough trucks to usually move half the division at one time. And here's what the German army really was. A bunch of young kids by 1944, horses. Again, you know, you think about that, 1944, and you're going to war with horses. I don't know if you've seen the TV show Band of Brothers. There's a great scene in the last episode, I think it is, where all the German prisoners are marching east, and the Americans are going west, and the Americans are all in vehicles, and the Germans have horses. And the guy's saying, "What were you thinking?" So, shaping operations. So shaping operations are how you set up for victory. So before you could invade Normandy, you had to have troops on the other side. So what the U.S. Army did was they set up what they called Operation Bolero, which was a buildup of American troops in Britain. And the reason for the name, if some of you may know this, but if you're a classical music fan, Ravel's Bolero, where it starts, and builds and builds and builds, and that was the idea. You'd start with a few troops and eventually have a zillion troops there. But first you had to win what Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic. You had to be able to get troops and airplanes and tanks and fuel and food, Spam to feed the British. That's why Spam is famous, because it could be shipped easily. And that's why, for any Monty Python fans, there's always Spam. But, so you had to win the Battle of the Atlantic. And the Allies did that, which enabled you to invade Europe. And they did that with a couple of cool things. The Royal Canadian Navy. The Royal Canadian Navy was probably responsible for most of the convoys that got across the Atlantic. Did anybody see the Tom Hanks movie, Greyhound? It's a great movie. It's based on a book from the 1950s by E.F. Forster called The Good Shepherd. But it's a great movie. Tom Hanks is a captain who's got to get a convoy across the Atlantic. That kind of sums up the whole thing. But so what they did was they built these small ships that could escort the convoys, and they built what's called the Very Long Range Liberator. It was a bomber with a lot of fuel tanks, and that could fly out over the Atlantic Ocean and find where the submarines were and drop depth charges on them. And of course, the famous Bletchley Park now that everybody knows about, breaking the German codes. That was another great movie. But that also enabled the Allies to find out where the U-boats were. Because the Germans, Admiral Dönitz, communicated with his U-boats and said, here's an Allied convoy, go to this location. And so you get the message, and you say, well, we're not going there. And you reroute the convoy. They also put out there, they eventually put escort carriers with the convoys. They found ways to put airplanes on ships so you could launch them off. And the most cool thing here is the Liberty ship. So this is an ugly duckling of all ships. The U.S. churned out, as you can see, 2,710 of these during World War II, before they went to a better model called the Victory ship. And these were mass-produced. In fact, at one time they did a stunt, and they built one in like 2 days. They couldn't really, but that was just for the cameras. But the point of this ship is it was very unlovely, it wasn't fast, it was armed with anti-aircraft guns and guns to shoot at submarines, but you built a lot of them. So if one sinks, that's okay. There's more where that came from. And as you can see, they were kind of square, and so you could load those with tanks and ammunition and spam and send them across the Atlantic Ocean a lot. They were based on like a British commercial ship from the mid-1920s. So these were another way that the US managed to win World War II because we sent these everywhere. Mostly these went across the Atlantic. In the Pacific, a little too far, you had to have different kind of ships in the Pacific. Another shaping operation. So during World War II, the Air Force was not the Air Force. It was the United States Army Air Forces. It was part of the Army. It started out as the Air Corps. And then it became the U.S. Army Air Forces. And they were devoted to the idea of strategic bombing. So during the 30s, they invented the Flying Fortress, which is this plane here. And the idea was it had a whole lot of machine guns on it, and it could fly into Germany or any enemy, drop a bunch of bombs, and get back because they had so many machine guns they could shoot down the fighters. Now that didn't work, but that was the concept. So in 1944, in the start of 1944, the Air Force leaders knew that the invasion was set for May of that year. But the German Air Force was still a going concern. And so one of the key things about any modern warfare, and again, if you've been paying attention to Ukraine, is you need command of the air. You want to have command of the air. So they decided that they were going to destroy the German Air Force in two ways. One was they would send up all these bombers to fly into Germany and blow up the aircraft plants. The other thing was they would also attack air bases, but mostly they were going to blow up the aircraft plants. So that was one way. But the real thing they did was by this time they had long-range fighter planes. The P-51, the P-47 with drop tanks. The P-51 could fly to Berlin and back and still shoot down a German airplane. So the idea was if we fly a bunch of aircraft into Germany, the Luftwaffe will have to come up and try to stop us, and we will destroy them. And that's exactly what they did. So the Luftwaffe came up to try to shoot down the American bombers, and they got shot down. Now, they killed more Americans than we killed them. As you can see, the Army Air Forces lost 2,000 airmen, dead, wounded, or POWs. The Luftwaffe lost 250 fighter pilots. So a fighter pilot is very hard to train. Most of those airmen who got shot down, they were gunners or bombardiers, and we were training just hundreds and hundreds of pilots. Because the thing that the Allies had going for them was you had all this airspace in Canada and the United States where there was no enemy. If you're a German pilot trying to learn how to fly, you never know when an American airplane is going to come along and blow you out of the sky. So it's kind of hard to focus on learning how to fly. Whereas if you're a British, Canadian, or American pilot, you're flying at some base in Winnipeg or in Kansas and no worries about anybody shooting you down. So you can just focus on learning how to fly and you get a lot of flying hours. So destroying those pilots, blowing up those aircraft factories, crippled the Luftwaffe. Again, if you've seen the movie The Longest Day, there's a famous scene where the German fighter pilot makes one pass over the beach and says, okay, we're done. So that is the other shaping operation, which was wiping out the German Air Force. And quite frankly, since 1943, I don't think an American infantryman has ever had to worry about what's on top of me. The U.S. Air Force's awe is ruled the skies. The other part of that was what they called the transportation plan. So the German army, Germany's a land power. So while we moved on ships, because we're, oceans away from everybody, the Germans moved on rails. And so they came up with this idea to blow the heck out of the German and French railroad network. So they would send bombers to destroy the rail yards. And the idea was you would isolate the Normandy beaches while you just blew the heck out of everything else so they couldn't figure out where you were coming. The one thing I'm not talking about here, you've probably heard about the big deception plan to make the Germans think that George S. Patton was going to invade at Caen. But So they blew up the rail network, and the fighter pilots who were escorting bombers over Germany, it wasn't like one set of fighter planes followed the bombers the whole way and back because the fighter pilots were too fast. So once they had completed as far as they were flying doing bomber escort, they would then turn around, and on the way back home, they would shoot up any railroad train they saw. And so the end result was this train in the bomb crater, and it just hampered the ability of the Germans to move troops and equipment to the Normandy area. So throughout that campaign, the Germans were just terrified of the Jagd bombers, which is the proper name for a fighter bomber in Germany, or they called them Jabos for short, because the Germans have such big, long words, The actual word for tank in German is Panzerkampfwagen, so that's why it's a Panzer. It's a lot easier to say, oh, look, a Panzer, than, oh, the Panzerkampfwagen is coming. So Germany depended on the railroads, and this is a German tank division. Those are Panther tanks, Panzer V, moving forward. So if you blow up the railroads, then you have a problem. So logistics. So we talked about some shaping operations, just a few of them. Then the logistics. So this is a giant roll of pipe. So one of the things the Allied planners thought about, and this was in 1943, was that if we're going to send a whole 2 mechanized armies to Europe, they're going to need fuel. How do we get it there? Well, we could send it across on ships, but that's kind of inefficient. So they said, a pipeline is a really good thing. So how do you put a pipeline under the English Channel in the middle of a war? So they came up with what they called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, and it was a specially designed pipe that was on this giant roll that floated, and they were literally, in the days after the invasion, they just unrolled it across the English Channel to Normandy. It's about 40 miles, I think, and that was how they got fuel to the other side of the English Channel. I remember my wife and I were in the Isle of Wight years ago. We were in the Army, and we came upon something that said this was the end of the Pluto, and I was like, I didn't know about that then. I looked it up and said, that's pretty cool. So that's a pretty good example of thinking about logistics. How were the Germans getting their fuel? They were trucking it forward. This is a lot better, and you didn't have to use another ship, and it's under the water. And when they had a really big storm that really messed everything up, just after the invasion, it wasn't affected by this. Okay, this is a boring thing, but U.S. Army field rations. So the Army, military rations are a whole field of study, but the Army had invested a lot of time and effort in trying to feed soldiers and make sure they had the right nutrition. Nowadays we have MREs, which are not that bad, even though people will call them meals rejected by everyone, meals rejected by Ethiopians, other things you shouldn't repeat. But the Army came up with these boxed rations that you could give to troops, and these are K rations over there on the left-hand side. This was like your emergency ration you throw in your pocket. But the point is, you found a way to feed all these people. And the U.S. Army has probably been the most well-fed army in the world since World War I. Now, the Spanish-American War was a bit of a fiasco, but since World War I, our army has eaten well. And so that's something you don't think about. The Germans didn't have the same kind of thing. Again, they had a 10-year supply line, and they were also living off the land. So you think about this. This is a 20th century war, and it's the same thought as in like 1750 that you raid the local farm, and that's where you got your food. So if you're supplying your troops with food, they don't have to worry about that. They can focus on their mission. Food is what you need to fight. Well-fed soldiers are better soldiers. So it's prosaic, but it makes a difference. This is the thing I really like. So this is a jerry can. Does anybody know where that got its name? So the British called the Germans jerrys. And so at the start of World War II, the Germans had this really cool fuel can. It was this. And the British had these really terrible fuel cans that were kind of like a Coleman camping fuel can, only bigger. If you're familiar with those, they're kind of flimsy, and these things were awesome. And the British said, well, heck, let's make these. And when the US Army started, and when the United States started making stuff for the British, they said, we want you to make these. And they called it the jerry can, because, you know, they stole it from the Jerry's. And the thing about this is, and I gotta tell you, same things used today, although now it's made out of really thick plastic. But the thing about this was, it had 3 handles on top, so you could easily carry it. You could put like 2 guys, and 1 guy in the middle, and 2 guys on either side carrying these things, and 2 on the outside. They stack really well. Those dents are designed to give the can more strength. Yes, rigidity, thank you. The thing about this is you think, okay, so it's a fuel can. Well, if you're moving hundreds of vehicles, thousands of vehicles, you need a way to refuel quickly. So Pluto brings your fuel across the ocean, then you gotta dump it in these things. So you can put them in the back of a 2.5-ton cargo truck, which is the other American secret weapon of World War II, and bring it forward. And these were great. We made millions of these things, 16 million. And they're all, yes sir.
What was the capacity? How many gallons?
I think that's 5 gallons. So, but you make enough of these, and the tanks of the day, you know, nowadays a tank will hold 350 gallons of fuel and burn it in 8 hours, and the tanks of the day didn't hold that much. But what you did is you sent these forward, and you can fuel your tanks, your trucks, your Jeeps, because it was really convenient to pull it out, open the stopper, put it in the tank, and throw it down the ground, and the quartermasters would pile it back in the empty truck and then go back to the rear. So it's not an exciting thing, it's not a cool weapon, but this lets you keep your army, that's the most mechanized in the history of the world, going. And we invested a lot in making these things. And it's, like I said, it's so good, every army in the world still uses something modeling this today, because it's foolproof. The other piece I wanted to talk about was, in order to have an invasion, you have to have a boat that works. So this was the Higgins boat, or the landing craft. So the Higgins boat was invented by a guy named Higgins, who was actually working on oil fields in Louisiana in the 1930s. And he wanted a boat that had a shallow bottom, so it could get into shallow places, and would carry a lot of stuff. So he designed this boat, and he also figured out the ramp idea. And when the Army went looking for some sort of landing craft, the Marines had a landing craft, but it didn't have the ramp. It was like a shallow bottom boat, and you still had to jump out over the sides, like people had for hundreds of years doing amphibious invasions. Prior to this, you put your soldiers in a boat, rowed ashore by a bunch of sailors, you jumped over the side into the surf, and waded ashore. So with this, you had a way to just drop the ramp, you could drive some small equipment off, and your troops could easily get out. So we built a bunch of these. And how many landing craft and where they were available sort of became the determining factor in when there was an amphibious invasion. And the National World War II Museum is in New Orleans today because of Mr. Higgins. They decided originally it was built there to honor the Higgins boat, because this thing is what enabled us to invade like 100 islands in the Pacific, and the coast of southern France, and the coast of North Africa, and Sicily, and Italy, and Normandy. The Germans, on the other hand, when they were actually thinking they were going to do an invasion, they planned for an invasion in 1940, Operation Sea Lion. Not being a naval power, they went and got a bunch of barges from the Rhine River and said, these are our landing craft. So they put these in a bunch of ports, and the RAF went over and bombed the crap out of them. But see, they just didn't think about this. They hadn't thought about an invasion, and this was going to be their fix. They never really came up with a landing craft again. The Germans didn't do. They did one invasion that was both a sea and air invasion, invasion of Crete, and that pretty much wiped out the German parachute corps. And they won, but it was what they call a pirate victory, obviously. And this is like the ultimate landing craft. This is a landing ship tank. So the US came up with these. So you could put tanks in this, you could put trucks in this. You just run this thing up on the coast and unload it with trucks full of gear driving off. There's a lot of pictures of the Normandy beaches with these things up on the sand, because you bring them in on high tide, the tide would go out, you unload them, then you wait for the tide to come in, then you back it off, and you go across England and get more stuff. So when I was a young officer at Fort Knox, they actually had a building that looked like an LST. They designed that building, they built it to look like an LST so they could figure out the best way to put equipment inside of it. And it was still there in 1982. Okay, so this is the other American secret weapon. We're talking about logistics. The US Army does logistics really well. So this is a 2.5-ton truck. This was the deuce and a half. Different kinds, usually modeled on a Studebaker model, but everybody made them. 500,000 trucks that were built, carried 2.5 tons. This is what brought your jerry cans forward, your rations forward, your ammunition forward. The Germans built 50,000 trucks. So think of that. So they tried to conquer Europe with 50,000 trucks. We built 500,000. Again, they were really outclassed logistically. One thing I didn't mention here, but after the invasion, of course, after the Normandy campaign, you have the breakout into France, and they put together the famous Red Bull Express, which was a round-the-clock operation of trucks going from the beaches to the front line, back to the beaches. Most of that was, most of those drivers were black soldiers because they had been put in quartermaster companies. The Army didn't think they could fight. By the end of World War II, they figured anybody who carried a gun could fight. But so they just had a continual round-the-clock chain of these trucks going back to the beaches, picking up supplies, and going forward. In fact, they stole trucks from some of the divisions in order to keep the other ones fighting in the battle. It was that important. But the 2.5-ton truck is like the hero of the Normandy campaign. This lets you supply your troops with all the stuff you need. And you're not chained to a railroad. This is the German equivalent. This is what the Germans didn't take pictures of usually. The Germans had what they called a PK company, the German Army, propaganda company. And their job was to make the German Army look awesome. So they didn't take pictures of horses stuck in the mud or guys in 1943 plodding forward behind army mules with a wooden wagon. So, again, there's a reason why the German Army was outclassed. This is the American equivalent then. A bunch of trucks in line, the Red Ball Highway, which we mentioned. And the other thing I want to talk about is that ungainly looking tank-like thing. That is a tank recovery vehicle. So tank recovery vehicles are the unsung heroes of the Armored Corps, because one of the rules of tanks is, 1, they'll break, and 2, they'll get stuck someplace. So this vehicle, which in World War II was modeled on a Sherman tank, would let you, if a tank's stuck or a tank gets shot up in battle, it lets you pull it back to the front line and fix it. There's a winch on top. That winch would haul out the engine. It's like a mobile workshop. It's a combination wrecker. It's like the AAA for armored vehicles, plus it's a mobile workshop. So that was a great thing. We still have those today. The latest version is the M88A2. It'll haul a 70-ton Abrams tank with no problems. So the other thing people talk about is tooth to tail. And again, amateurs will sometimes say, well, you only have, in this case, only 39% of your soldiers are in combat units, therefore you're so wasteful. Well, that's true, but the thing is, those 39% of soldiers have all the bullets and fuel and weapons and everything they need to fight because the other guys are bringing it forward. And the U.S. Army has made the decision a long time ago that you need a big tail. If you're going to fight a modern war, you need a big tail because having lots of stuff keeps people alive. The German Army, on the other hand, had 60% of their soldiers in the combat elements. So it sounds good, but again, their supplies are coming forward on horses. So, not as good. So this is something I want to talk about. I find this very fascinating. There's a historian who talked about this. I'm stealing everything from John Holland. So the Germans had what they called, this was a German machine gun at the start of the war. And this is a doctrine thing. The German squad was built around the machine gun. You had a machine gunner and 2 assistants, and the other 6 guys in squad, their whole job was to keep the machine gunner alive. So they built around the machine gun. So they called this the bone saw. It could shoot 900 rounds a minute. It was lightweight, and it was a multi-purpose machine gun. You could put this up on a tripod, and so you could fire it like this from a bipod. You could put it on a tripod. The reason you put a machine gun on a tripod is now you have a traversing elevation mechanism. It's more accurate. You get better distance. We do the same thing today. We have in the U.S. Army today, the equivalent is the 240B machine gun. You can fire it like that from a bipod. You can maybe put it in a tank, or you can put it on a tripod. Anyhow, but here's the problems. 900 rounds per minute is a lot of ammunition. So, they call it the bone saw because it sounded like brick, like a saw cutting a bone. The barrels had to be replaced when hot. Most of the machine guns we have today, you can clip off the barrel, put it on. But if you're firing that much, it gets really hot. The problem with a hot barrel is you can get a round cooking off, and it changes the accuracy. The barrels had to be replaced, 6 barrels per weapon. And I remember doing this when I was a young officer cadet, and big mittens to pick up the hot machine gun barrel and put the new one on. So it's bulky. Here's the most interesting. It took 150 man-hours to make one of these things because Germans love to over-engineer everything. Everything the German army built in World War II was over-engineered, even the uniforms. They put all kinds of doodads on their uniforms so they look really cool. Germans had the best uniforms, hands down, they looked spiffy. But all that stuff took extra time. The British and Americans looked like Joe the Ragman, but their uniforms worked, and it didn't take that much time. And the other thing is, because it was so finely machined, it jammed in, sand. So if you're in North Africa fighting the British and your machine gun keeps jamming, that's not a good thing. So this is the American equivalent, and it looks kind of dorky, which it is. It's a tripod-mounted machine gun that they put on a bipod and gave you a really weird-looking buttstock there. So it's a 30 caliber Browning machine gun, best used on a tripod mount, but you could give it to guys and they could use this in their platoon. It's much heavier, 400 rounds per minute. So it didn't fire as fast. So if you're not firing as fast, your ammo goes further. I mean, it's still a machine gun. It's still shooting out of bullets. That extra, 500 rounds a minute sounds impressive, but does it really do anything more? It's still a machine gun. Nobody's going to charge that thing. The barrel doesn't overheat as readily. And here's the thing I like best. It only took 19 man-hours to build one of these. So for every one German machine gun, the U.S. Army could produce 9. So again, over-engineered. So you have a lot more machine guns. That's a doctrine thing. We chose this weapon. And it was also robust. We used it in jungles, the desert, Western Europe. It worked fine everywhere. So this is a German rifle. This is what the average German Lanzer carried. This rifle was designed in 1898. This was the same rifle the Germans had carried in World War I. It was a short-barreled bolt action. It's the famous Mauser rifle, which we copied scandalously in the 1903 Springfield. But the problem with the bolt action weapon is that every time you put a bullet in, you got to take your eyes off the target. Because you got to take it down, you got to cock it, you got to bring it back up to your eyesight again. Anybody who's ever shot a rifle will understand that's kind of annoying. So it slows down your rate of fire. And again, it didn't really matter to the Germans because the main killer in their squad was that MG-34 machine gun, later on replaced by the MG-42 machine gun. So they didn't really care if the average soldier had a bolt-action rifle. This was our weapon, the M1 Garand. This was a semi-automatic weapon that fired 8 bullets in a clip, which is why today, even though we use magazines, guys will still talk about a clip. And you didn't have to stop shooting. You just pulled the trigger. You didn't have to re-engage the sight every time you wanted to shoot again. You didn't have to take your eye off, move the bolt, put it back up. You could empty that magazine in about 5 or 6 seconds. and it was very accurate. So again, there's a quote from Patton, the greatest battle implement ever devised. So these were all over the place. So what happened is, so the US Army made up for not having that really loud, cool machine gun with having every soldier having one of these, and then they gave you a BAR. But this allowed an American soldier to fire more bullets faster, more accurately than his counterpart. The other thing here that often gets overlooked is the artillery. So every branch in the U.S. Army has a little slogan. So the infantry is the queen of battle, and back in the day there were lots of jokes about that. And the armor is the combat arm of decision, and the artillery is the king of battle, because the artillery is what kills the most people. So if again you're following what's going on in Ukraine today, it's all about artillery. So during World War II, the U.S. Army had the best artillery in the world. The British and Canadian were second. Germans were back down there. They weren't as good. The main thing is that during the period prior to World War II, the Americans had figured out how to idiot-proof artillery. So the way you do indirect fire artillery, traditionally, was a battery of artillery would set up, they would send a guy forward, a spotter with a field telephone, and he would sit in the front lines, and he would direct the fire of his battery of guns, which could be 4 to 6 guns. So that's pretty good, but it's only 4 to 6 guns. So what the Americans figured out how to do was how to, they cut corners. They had standard firing charges, because what you do with each of those artillery rounds, depending on the distance, you put a different amount of propellant behind that shell. So if you're firing a long distance, you put more propellant in. If you're firing less, you take it out. Anybody who ever did that when they were in the Army will remember, you have to stand up showing how many bags are in the shell casing. So what the U.S. Army figured out how to do is what they call a time on target. So you would take so instead of just directing 4 to 6 guns, they figured out how to get all 36 cannons in an infantry division, plus the additional maybe 20 they had from the Corps, all shooting at the same place simultaneously. So they would figure out, like, okay, you're over here, you're 6 miles away, you're going to fire at 5:35, and you're 3 miles away, so you're going to fire at 5:37, and everything's going to converge on the same place at the same time and just blow everything up. And the U.S. Army knew how to do this. And so the Germans were very famous for counterattacking. That's how they'd won. If they got kicked off an objective, they counterattacked. And they had always figured that they had, 10, 15 minutes before the artillery came in. Well, with the U.S. Army, they didn't. The Germans would be attacking, and the time on target would come in, and they would all get killed. So this was very effective in the close-in fighting in Normandy. So it was something that we had developed. We shared it with our British and Canadian counterparts. They had been working on it too. The Germans never quite got that. The Russians would just line up artillery hub to hub and blow everything up in front of them. But this was really flexible, and then they came up with the proximity fuse, which uses radar to detonate at a certain level above the ground. And when they finally decided that they could use it, they again would wipe out the Germans. So this was another thing we had going for us that they didn't. So this is a Sherman tank, and it's not very sexy. You'll see on the internet, there's a lot of people who, they get all excited about German tanks. Did anybody see the movie Fury here? Okay, so, they had the Tiger, and the Tiger's awesome, and although there's no way in the world a Tiger would have come out and fought an American tank in the open, but it was cool. But the point of this is that we built 50,000 of these between 1942 and 1945. And we equipped our army, the Canadian Army, the British Army, with this tank. So the thing about this was, it had a 75 millimeter gun, which was really big in 1942. And so we kind of standardized it there, 75 millimeter gun. And it was easy to ship. It weighed 30 tons. It's square, it's squat. You can see there's loops on it. That was put there in the factory, so when you put it on a ship, you just put the hooks on, pick it up, put it in the hole. The other thing it had going for it was really mechanically reliable. It didn't break that much, and if it did break that much, a tank is moved forward by what they call the final drive. If you look in the front, you'll see a sprocket with all kind of pointy things like a star. So the final drive is in the front there. If the final drive broke in a Sherman tank, you undid some bolts, you pulled off the cover, you put another final drive on, and you're good to go. The other thing it did was it had a gyro stabilized gun. It had a power traverse in the turret, which meant you would swing your gun onto the target, and the gyroscope would let you get on target quicker than another German tank. They didn't have that. So it was a little more accurate, it could fire more quickly, and the thing is, we kind of get into and I'm an armor guy, so this is what we all focus on, the tank-to-tank combat, but the US Army didn't plan on shooting German tanks with American tanks. We had a whole separate branch called the Tank Destroyer Branch, which was specially designed to kill German tanks. So these were supposed to run around, break through the German front line, run around and shoot up everything they could see. And it worked really well for that. And it turned out it also did okay for German tanks when you put a longer gun on it. But the point was, this was made to go everywhere, and it worked. All right, so this is the German Tiger I tank, the Panzer VI. It had an 88 millimeter gun, which could kill anything. It was heavy. They were organized into special battalions. But it was 54 tons in the 1940s. You couldn't get that over most bridges. Another reason our tank was 30 tons is because the standard engineered bridge to cross a water obstacle supported 30 tons. So when they decided to design the tank, it can't be more than 30 tons because we are going to be attacking and we have to get across the bridge. The problem with this was when the Germans moved these by rail, they had to take off that track and put a different track on. So you couldn't just roll off the rail car into combat. You had to stop and put another track on. So that complicates things. And then all these wheels are interleaving there. You can't see it here, but so if the back wheel needs to get fixed, the back row wheel, well, you got to take off two of the ones in front of it. Slows down the repair time. The engine is buried under the back plate, which it should be, but so is the final drive. So it's harder to get at. Again, it used a lot of fuel, 120 gallons of fuel to move 60 miles. So an M1 will burn 320 gallons of fuel to go 320 miles, pretty much. So this was not really efficient. So again, they built 1,317 of these again. They could have built 21 105 millimeter howitzers for each Tiger I tank. So it's a pretty awesome looking thing, but the Panzer IV was a good tank, and probably if they put more money into building Panzer IVs, they would have done better. But this was awesome, it looks cool, and it scared everybody. Every American GI I read once thought every tank that fired at them was a Tiger. So I talked about how this was a campaign. And so the campaign in Normandy ended with what was called Operation Cobra. And this was where the US Army put together all these things I was talking about, the air power, the armor, the tanks, the logistics, the guys who had learned how to fight well, the artillery. And they decided that they were going to break the stalemate, which had been going on now for like 2 months. You may have heard of the hedgerow fighting, which is field by field by field, which the Germans liked, because that negated all the US Army advantages, or a lot of them. And so what they were going to do was they were going to take a whole bunch of 4-engine bombers, and a whole bunch of medium bombers, and a whole bunch of artillery, and just blow a hole in the German lines. And that was General Bradley's plan, and it worked. Now there was some problems because what happens is you progressively bomb an area, you tend to bomb closer to your own lines, and so that's when we killed a 4-star general. The highest ranking US Army general ever killed in action, 4-star General Leslie McNair, was killed by the US Air Force because he had gone forward to see the battle and the bomb fell in his foxhole. But so Operation Cobra combined all this stuff. We blew up the German front line. The Germans were stunned. Then the tanks, which had been supplied by fuel and jerry cans, brought across the ocean by the rolling pipeline, with all the soldiers who were carrying M1 rifles and the artillery that could easily register and shoot, all combined to blow a big hole in the German lines, and the US Army just went out and around, and the idea was to close in on the Germans from behind. And by the time the German Army left, they'd lost like 50,000 guys in a Feliz pocket, and we're basically just running away. As somebody once put, a historian put it, the Germans were losing faster than the Americans could win. So, but that is the conclusion. Again, there's the map with all the arrows. That's the end of the Normandy campaign. And hopefully the end of me talking, I think I went 6 minutes over, sorry. If anybody has any questions or would like to tell me I'm full of crap, that's okay too. Thank you very much.